Hello everybody, welcome back to another exciting edition of Ed Puzzle Lecture Notes. Today's daily objectives. What are the reactants and products of the two reactions in photosynthesis? So we're not talking about the reactants and the products of photosynthesis as a whole, but what are the reactants and products of the two reactions or the two steps in photosynthesis? The first step is called the light-dependent reaction. The light-dependent reaction. There's going to be some reactants that come into the light reaction, and then there's going to be some products which come out. The second step of photosynthesis, the second reaction, is called the light-independent reaction, or the Calvin cycle. Now, the products of the light-dependent reaction are going to be used in the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reaction, is going to have different reactants, and it's going to make different things. It's going to have different products. So that's what we're going to focus on. What are the reactants and products of each of these two steps? And finally, in our lab, what are two things which can increase or decrease the rate of photosynthesis? All right, so the two stages of photosynthesis, there are two separate stages. The first one's called the light-dependent reaction. And remember, the light-dependent reaction occurs in the thylakoid membrane. Thylakoid membrane. And remember, the thylakoids, this is a chloroplast down here, this little oval. Remember, the thylakoids are the green discs inside of the chloroplast. And it's green because, remember, it contains the pigment chlorophyll. So the light-dependent reaction takes place in the thylakoids. Now the second reaction, the second step of photosynthesis is the light-independent reaction, or the Calvin cycle, and it takes place in what's called the stroma. Remember, the stroma is the gel-like fluid in the chloroplast that's located outside of the green thylakoids. Now in the light reaction, this is when we're using water, and it's also obviously when light is being used. So don't worry about drawing this little chloroplast, because the next slide is going to have it drawn for you. But the light reaction is where water is coming in, and it's also where sunlight is being used. Now the water is used, the sunlight actually splits the water into its two hydrogens and its oxygen, and that's where oxygen gets released into the air. Now for us, it's great that plants make oxygen gas for us to breathe, but that's not why they go through the light-dependent reaction. And we're going to go over this in detail on the next lecture. But in this one, what plants get, what autotrophs get from the light reaction, they get energy in the form of ATP, and water is used because it donates its electrons. It donates high-energy electrons, which hopefully you remember, the molecule that carries those electrons is NADPH. And it is the energy from the ATP and the NADPH made in the light reaction that's going to go to the light-independent reaction. And in that reaction, it's going to use the energy from the ATP and the electrons in NADPH to make the final product of photosynthesis called glucose, C6H12O6. And a little table that compares both reactions in photosynthesis. The first reaction is the light-dependent reaction. This is what uses light. It needs light for this to occur. Cannot happen in the dark. Where does it occur? Remember, it's in the green discs within the chloroplast called the thylakoids. It's in the green disc called the thylakoids, and precisely in the membrane, or the outer layer of the thylakoids. So the thylakoid membrane, that's where it occurs. Now I'm going to skip the reactants. I'm going to go to the products first. The products, remember, in the light reaction, they're not making glucose sugar yet. They're making energy molecules. They need the energy from these energy molecules in order to make glucose. And it gets it from the molecules ATP, the main energy molecule, and also it needs the high energy electrons, which are carried by the molecule NADPH. Remember, we will go over this in detail in the next lecture. And also in this reaction, remember, oxygen, or O2, is released into the air. But mainly, plants, that's just a waste or a byproduct. Plants need the energy in these two molecules, the NADPH and the ATP, which are going to be used in the next reaction. So, what is required? Remember, this is where water is used. Water gets split and it donates its electrons, which are going to become energized, and they're going to be used later in the light-independent reaction. Well, we also need ADP, because if we're going to make ATP, we're going to have to start with ADP, and it's going to get charged up. Another phosphate is going to be added to it to form ATP. And we also need the other dead battery called NADP. NADP and it's plus, but you don't need to know that. So we need NADP because in the light reaction, it's going to pick up the electrons that were donated by water. It's going to pick up a hydrogen and 2 electrons to form the energy molecule NADPH. Now on to the light-independent reaction, or the Calvin cycle. Remember, this occurs in the gel-like fluid within the chloroplast called the stroma. This is where we're going to need the carbon. We're going to need the carbon in CO2. And we also need the charged batteries. We need ATP, the energy in ATP, and we need the electrons carried by NADPH. And what is the final product of photosynthesis? Of course, it is glucose, C6H12O6. That's the main product. That's what plants are trying to make. That's their food. They could also turn that into cellulose, which becomes like the main structural part of the plant. But they also make 2 dead batteries. ATP, the energy is used, so it turns back into ADP. And the electrons in NADPH are used, so it turns back into NADP. And both of these guys, the dead batteries, the ADP and the NADP, are going to go back to the light reaction to become charged up again, to become ATP and NADPH. And now I definitely would draw this diagram. Remember, this is a chloroplast. The whole little oval thing, that's a chloroplast. On the left, we have the light-dependent reaction, and on the right, we have the light-independent reaction, or called the Calvin cycle. Now, you're probably going to see this diagram again. I guarantee on a quiz or an exam, you're going to see it. So, everything that goes in to the light reaction, that's going to be reactant. So this is where light, of course, is used. This is also where water, H2O, comes in. Remember, where does it occur at? It occurs in these green discs called the thylakoids. Now, what else is used? We need the dead battery of NADP and the other dead battery of ADP. And both of those are coming into the thylakoids to be charged up. So, NADP is going to become NADPH. And that's because it picked up 2 electrons, 2 high energy electrons, also a hydrogen. Of course, ADP, they're going to add a phosphate to it, a third phosphate, for it to become ATP. And that energy is going to be used over here in the Calvin cycle. And obviously, this is also where oxygen gas, or O2, is released by the plant or algae or whatever it is that's going through photosynthesis. Now, over here in the Calvin cycle, this is where the CO2 is going to be needed because we need the carbons in order to make glucose. So the CO2 comes in. Also, these 2 charged batteries, the energy of the ATP and mainly the electrons, that are being carried by NADPH, the energy in those two molecules is used to convert carbon dioxide into glucose, which is C6H12O6. And remember, this Calvin cycle, the light-independent reaction, occurs in the gel-like fluid called the stroma. And like always, now it is quiz time. So let's see how you do on all of these questions. All right, so number one, what is the main pigment involved in photosynthesis? It's called